Hi there. How y'all doing today? Y'all good? Welcome to Bayside. My name's Brian, one of the pastors around here. Welcome, especially if you're a guest. Maybe you're here just investigating and kicking the tires of faith, exploring matters of faith, and we're really, really glad you're here. We are in this preaching series that we call, what's it called? Skeptical. Challenges to Christianity, where we're delving into some of the toughest questions about the validity of our faith in God, about faith in God. We're actually welcoming questions about faith that the church hasn't always fully embraced, let alone given prime preaching time to tackle some of them, but we are. We feel very strongly about this. If you weren't here last week, our co-pastor, Pastor Brandon Short, who's just a remarkably gifted, talented, beautiful human being, isn't he? He's just an amazing, yes. He kicked the series off unpacking a really hard look at the Bible, because that's kind of where all of this rises and falls. Can we really trust the Bible? Is it reliable? And so if you missed that one, go get it, stream it, podcast it, vodcast it, all the ways that you can get it to yourself. It was very, very powerful. Did strong work. And then today we're turning our attention to the subject of just this wee little topic, science and the existence of God, right? Have fun with that, Brian. And speaking of the existence of God, tell me that 49er game the other day doesn't prove that there's a God and that he is 49er faithful. God himself is 49er faithful. And oh boy, yikes. And there's always a couple of heretics in the place. No, just kidding. Just kidding. And here's why we're taking up these really, really challenging subjects. Jesus paints this for us with crystal clear. Why are we having this conversation? Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. This will be familiar to a bunch of you. Here it is. Jesus says, look, if you follow me, if you know me, if you trust me, if you put your full weight and trust of faith in me and on me, there are some applications to our lives more than just the sort of intellectual assent to like, yes, I believe there's a God, and yes, I call myself a Christian. Jesus actually says you're going to order your entire life and being around him. And he says, here's what that looks like. That you would, this familiar to anybody? Raise your hand if you heard this verse before. That you would love the Lord your God with all your what first? Heart first. With all your what second? Soul second. And then this little one, with all your what? With your mind. Right? Jesus is saying, and he could have answered this question in any way possible. He could have gone like, yeah, faith in me, belief in me, trust in me, ordering your life around me, calling yourself a follower of mine. He could have answered that question any way he wanted to. And he says, guys, our faith cannot just be a heart-soul thing. It would then only be like a two-legged stool, and how's that going to work for you? It's going to fall over. It's a three-legged stool. It can't miss anything. So if you're going to call yourself a follower of Jesus, if you're going to order your life around him, if you're going to rely on him for new quality and a new quantity of life starting right here, right now, extending for the next billion years, all of eternity, you will love me, he says, with your heart, with your soul, and with your mind. We must bring our full intellectual rigor to bear in our relationship with God. Somebody say amen to that. It cannot just be a heart and soul thing. We can't shy away from these kinds of hard, skeptical, peel back the layers, get underneath the foundation of our faith. We cannot shy away from these kinds of conversations. We can't bristle when these kinds of questions come our way. We don't shrink back. We shouldn't shrink back. We can't be afraid of, oh my gosh, I might discover something that causes me to doubt. We cannot shy away. Jesus says, plunge all in. Heart, soul, mind. On this faith journey. Intellect included. And these are going to be, today in particular, is going to be a little more teachy, right? A little content heavy. So hang with me, buckle in. I'm indebted to a bunch of people for their really, really important work that helped me put this message together. A guy named Stephen. Some of these are on your outline. You could write down some of these because these are great resources that you could go to on your own for your own further study. A guy named Stephen Meyer, a guy named Francis Collins, a guy named Alistair McGrath, a guy named Norm Geisler, a guy named Carey Nieuwhof, a guy named Mark Clark. Anybody know that one? Tim Keller, C.S. Lewis, and so. So it all starts for me. The relationship between science and the existence of God goes all the way back to high school for me. And obviously, a little tongue-in-cheek, it goes way back further than the 1990s, right? But in high school, it became very real for me. It was Billings, Montana West High School, it was called. It was my sophomore year. The teacher was Mr. Miller, and you can guess what class it was. Yes, it was biology class. Anybody else have this experience? Right? It all came home to roost in biology class. And I have no idea whether Mr. Miller was talking straight to me when he said it, but on kickoff day of the section where we were going to learn about and talk about and discuss and unpack Charles Darwin and his theory of what? Evolution. It was on that day Mr. Miller started the class by saying, I've been teaching this for 20 years. And every time in 20 years that I've been teaching this segment, I have students who lose their mind, and he said those words, when we talk about Darwin and his theory of evolution. They want to debate me on this stuff, and he said, I'm going to tell you the exact same thing that I've been telling my classes, all of them for the last 20 years, and I'm quoting just about verbatim here. I expect you to leave your Sunday school understanding about God, about how the universe and life came into existence at home. It's not welcome here. That's what Mr. Miller said. Which, looking back on it all these years later, reminds me of the little girl who was in her school one day, and the teacher was teaching the elementary school class about whales, right? And the teacher said, now class, what do you know about whales, right? And this little girl in the third row or so shoots her hand up in the air and said, teacher, call on me, the little girl, right? And the teacher said, yes, whatever her name was, Susie, we'll call her Susie. That was not her name probably, but we'll call her that. A whale, Susie said, swallowed a guy named Jonah in the Bible. And the teacher kind of chuckles and says, oh, that's nice, Susie, but there's no way that the biblical story of Jonah and the whale could possibly be true. And the teacher goes up to the whiteboard and draws a whale and says, look, the throat of the whale could not possibly swallow a human being. The girl's like insisting. She's pounding on her to, it's true, I know it's true. And someday when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask Jonah, and he's going to tell me that he got swallowed by a whale. And the teacher smiles and says, well, what if Jonah isn't in heaven, Susie? And Susie's sharp. She's very smart. She quickly shoots back, well, then you can ask him. So I felt a little bit like that with Mr. Miller. And I liked Mr. Miller. I thought Mr. Miller was a cool guy. All the people in my school liked Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller was on the ski patrol at the mountain where just about our whole school snow skied every weekend through the wintertime. And we all had stories of outrunning Mr. Miller when he was trying to catch us skiing out of bounds or skiing too fast or jumping where we weren't supposed to be jumping and all this stuff. And then we go to school on Monday like, Mr. Miller, you didn't catch me again this week. And he's like, I was you, under the balaclava. He has no idea who we are. But all of a sudden, I expect you to leave your Sunday school understanding about God and the universe and how life came into existence at home. It's just not welcome here. And all of a sudden, I didn't like Mr. Miller anymore. I was like, dude. And I was a fiery sophomore in high school and not very self-aware. And so I pushed back, and I pushed back hard. I shoot my hand. I'm like Susie, hand going up in the air. And I, Mr. Miller, are you saying that we should just believe that evolutionary theory only, and it's the only and final answer to life, and I pointed out the window of our second story biology room, how all of this came into existence. We're just supposed to believe that is the final answer. Yes, he said, because there's simply no evidence for any other explanation. He said, there's no, and I was like, wham, the door slammed right in my, like nothing else Not even any conversation. This is it and it alone. And of course, I didn't realize it back then. I'm a 15-year-old sophomore in high school who had acne on my acne. Looking back now, it all is very, very clear. Mr. Miller, along with a whole bunch of other people who we run into in popular culture, have subscribed to this idea that, ready, science and faith in God, or even belief that there is a God, must be, has to be, always will be mutually exclusive. A whole bunch of people in this world today, including Mr. Miller and a whole bunch of popular scientists who we read to this very day, the new atheists, they're called. You can look them up and go read about them if you're so inclined. That science, they propagate this theory that science is entirely antithetical to faith. And that, oh, by the way, science always eclipses faith. And the scientific mind and the scientific conversation always holds the upper hand to the faith conversation because they're smarter, they're better educated, they know more, and we're just low IQ faith people. But can I politely and kindly push back ever so gently on that? Can we, are your heads nodding? Can we push back on that with all due respect? Can we push back on that? Because this supposed war between faith and science, by the way, is the product primarily of a couple of writings from the late 19th century. I looked these up. Here's exactly how it unfolded. There was a guy named Charles Darwin. He published his seminal work called The Origin of the Species, which is his theory on what? Evolution, right? He published that work in the year 1859. Immediately, 1860, immediately following that work's publication by Darwin, two guys, one of them named Draper, one of them named Dixon White, publisher Andrew Dixon White, William Draper, they published two of their own individual separate works which stoked the fire of division between religious critics of Darwinism and the advance of science. It's like they knew what was going to happen. And so they came out swinging. Draper felt very strongly that organized religion, which, by the way, if you're sitting here today, you're de facto part of organized religion, felt very strongly that organized religion was a direct and existential threat to the advancement of science. Here's what he said. Christianity and science are recognized by their respective adherents as being absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. One must yield to the other. Mankind, humankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. But I kindly, graciously, carefully push back on that theory. To Draper and White and those who agreed with him, science and science alone stands for freedom and progress, while religion stands for superstition and repression. That was the line that was being communicated. That's what they wrote about. That's what they were propagating. That's the message that they were transmitting in this world, into this culture. Guys, but there's a problem with that view that they were propagating. Well, there certainly, admittedly, have been challenges posed by the scientific community to the Judeo-Christian views of biological origins, geological history in particular. A great number of scientific historians and scientists themselves take note that the belief in God, that faith in God, that Christianity specifically has always played a vital role in the advance of modern science, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries. As a matter of fact, if you tear into this a bit, belief in God was actually the catalyst that served to inspire vast scientific advances, was the actual framework for explaining many, many scientific observations, especially during the period known as the Scientific Revolution, which is about the years 1500 through 1750. This 250-year span of time that we call the Scientific Revolution. And this is very fascinating to think about. I had a blast tearing into all this. So scientists and scientific historians call this, write this little phrase down, material necessities. Because scientists and scientific historians say, look, there are these material necessities that have to be present in a society in order for great actual science to exist. There has to be, meaning like, you can't have a primitive civilization where everybody's running around all day, every day, just wondering where their next meal is going to come from and expect that that culture is actually going to be able to conduct great science. Why can't they do that? Because they're just fixated on what? Where's my next meal going to come from? How am I going to eat the next meal? Great science is not going to come out of that kind of a culture. And so you look at some of the great civilizations of bygone eras, the Egyptians, for example. The Egyptians were an incredibly advanced society that definitely would have had the, quote, material necessities present for conducting great science. They built the pyramids, for crying out loud. Certainly, they weren't just fixated on where's our next meal going to come from. They're conducting these incredible projects that it would have taken great scientific advance to conduct. Think about the Chinese. The Chinese invented the compass, the compass. Like, you talk about a scientific and technological feat. The compass, block printing came from China, and for crying out loud, gunpowder, right? Who's saying amen and thank God for gunpowder? Right? The Chinese invented, they definitely had the material necessities for conducting great science. The Romans certainly did. Building roads, they were seafaring, they were trading, they were building aqueducts, they were doing all these massive, like, civil engineering projects. They had the material necessities necessary. The Greeks, for crying out loud, they had the material necessities. All these great philosophers, many of whom studied nature quite extensively. And yet scientific historians and scientists themselves look back. They look at these very, very well-developed, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Romans, the Greeks, and they say, though they were very advanced as a society, they still didn't develop the systems for investigating nature that only came to bear in Western Europe between the years of 1500 and 1750, this era we call the Scientific Revolution, which causes them to lean back and say, what in the world was the X factor? What was it that was present in Western Europe between the years of 1500 and 1750 that was the X factor that so suddenly and so sweepingly compelled human beings to begin to unlock nature's secrets in such a revolutionary and systemic way as happened in those 250 years? Do you have any idea what it was? It was faith in God. Faith in God. It was belief that there was God, that there is a God. And this isn't just theoretical, that they're actually doing evidentiary research that points to this, that the Judeo-Christian ideas that were prevalent in Europe prior to the 16th and 17th centuries were, watch this, the fertile soil out of which grew that scientific revolution unlike any that had ever been seen in all of human history. The Greeks, absolutely, they were heroes of Western intellectual tradition. And yet they had these wild sort of assumptions about causation in particular that were actually serving to get in the way of real empirical observational approaches to studying nature in an empirical, scientifically methodological way. Yes, I can speak. A whole bunch of Greek ideas, as a matter of fact, brought about this sort of, one guy called it this sort of random and sterile armchair philosophizing, he calls it, that weren't hitched to any actual observations. It was just sort of like, I wonder what I can think about today, these very ethereal postulations. Stuff like there was a guy named Pythagoras. You've all heard of Pythagoras, right? He's a what subject of study? He's a math guy, right? What's it called? Pythagorean theorem, right? He's best known for that thing. But this guy held some very peculiar beliefs, including, ready for this, a prohibition from eating beans. Do not eat beans, he said. No kind of bean. Kidney bean, black bean, pinto bean, fava bean. What's another kind of bean? Green bean. Don't eat the bean. And the reason for Pythagoras' bean ban are thought to be related to his belief that human souls must reside in beans. Human souls inside of beans. Now, ask the question, guys. Like, did Pythagoras have any observational basis for souls of human beings residing in beans? Like, where would that idea come from, except for a guy sitting around going like, I think there's a soul inside of a... He didn't have any evidence whatsoever. It was random armchair philosophizing, as one guy has called it. And if you think that a human soul lives in a bean, how far are you really going to get with real, investigative, observational, empirical, scientific discovery? What's the answer? Not very far, are you? What about this one? There's a guy named Empedocles. Empedocles believed in the idea of reincarnation, and there's a lot of different cultures and belief systems that believe in reincarnation. But this guy actually believed that he himself had been reincarnated not just once, but 2 different times. And he was so compelled, he believed that one time he had been reincarnated as a bush, and another time he had been reincarnated as a bird, right? And you're like, what? Where in the world? Now, Empedocles, poor guy, met a very unfortunate and dramatic end. He jumped inside of Mount Etna to prove to people that he was a small g god. And that's how he expired, right? But Empedocles didn't have any observational basis for the fact that he had been reincarnated not once, but twice. Like what would make a person think that he'd been reincarnated as a bush? Where does that come from? And then as a bird, like what? What are the random philosophizing that was going to actually impede the progress of hard scientific discovery? Scientific historians, scientists themselves, declare that it was only by a reaffirmation of the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation during the late Middle Ages and the Protestant Reformation is what it took to break with the prevailing Greek thinking that was actually limiting the advance of science. Again, this supposed war, this supposed dichotomy that exists between science and faith and belief in God is a manufactured phenomenon. It is not an actual reality. As a matter of fact, spiritual belief among scientists is far more prevalent than we've been made to believe it is. The year 1916, which was a fair piece ago, researchers asked biologists, physicists, and mathematicians whether or not they believed in a God who was and it wasn't just believe it. Do you believe in God? That wasn't the end of the question. The question went on. Do you believe in a God who is actively communicating with humanity and to whom one may pray in expectation of receiving a reply? So they actually qualify the question, wanting to know who's actually a believer in faith in God, not just sort of intellectual. Say, yeah, I believe there's something out there, there's a God, but an actual follower of God, follower of Jesus. Do you believe in a God who is actively communicating with humanity and to whom one may pray in expectation of receiving a reply? 40% of biologists, physicists, mathematicians answered in the affirmative the year 1916. Fast forward almost 100 years later, the exact same survey was repeated, absolutely verbatim, same question. To the absolute stunned shock of those who were doing this research, the percentage remained absolutely, nearly, entirely unchanged. Regardless of the advance of scientific discovery over the course of 1916, almost 100 years forward. So you ask the question, what in the world does that mean? What does that tell us? It tells us that perhaps the supposed war between science and faith might not be quite as polarizing as it might have been made to seem in the beginning. It means that a whole bunch of really smart scientists are looking at the hard scientific empirical evidence and going, it sure seems like God is actually a God of science. He himself is a God of science. Now look, I know in a room this size, I know in addition to all the people who are watching online, everybody who's within the hearing of my voice, There are people, I have absolutely no doubt, who are very, very, very skeptical about the existence of God, whether there even is a God, let alone the question of faith in God, let alone the coexistence of God and science. I get that. And I greatly, greatly respect, hear me say, I greatly respect that. I know we all have our reasons for arriving at the systems of belief that we have arrived at. But could I just ask one little favor, please? And I ask very humbly, very gently, would you be willing to kindly, graciously, gently reconsider the assumptions that you've made that have led you to that decision? Would you just hold them maybe a bit more loosely than maybe you have, and would you just be open to rethinking those assumptions? And here's why. Because what if, and this is just a what if science is the lens through which we see God? Would you just be willing to ask and answer that question? What if science is, instead of being polarized from faith, what if science is actually one of the very useful, helpful tools through which we see God and who He is and what He's like and what He's about, and that He's actually a personal God, not just far away, removed, and detached, but actually involved in the day-to-day, not just of this world, but actually of our very lives? Would you just be open to reconsidering that? What if science isn't the dividing line between faith and reason? What if science and the things that scientists are discovering every single day isn't what turns you off to faith in God, but what if it's actually the thing that helps you begin to actually make sense of Him and who He is and what He is about? What if science is the lens through which you actually see God? King David of Israel, he wrote about 1,000 years before Jesus Christ was born, which means that he wrote this passage we're about to read from the Bible about 3,000 years ago. Psalm chapter 19, starting in verse 1. Look at what King David writes. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Now look, we all live in an incredibly beautiful place, don't we? Like, the privilege of getting to live where we live is absolutely stunning. Like, what if you had to live in some godforsaken, what if you had to live in Ohio, right? Like, look where they call it the Rust Belt, right? Literally, where we get to live is spectacular. How many of you have had a King David moment when you've been standing and you've said in your heart, or maybe even out of your mouth, something, the heavens declare? You've looked out and seen, the heavens declare. How many of you have done it where we live? Yes, of course. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Verse 2, day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They point to something. The heavens, this creation, this created one, points to something. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them. Yet, verse 4, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun, like the bridegroom coming out of his chamber, verse 5. Like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and it makes its circuit. Right? King David, 3,000 years ago. It makes its circuit to the other, nothing deprived of its warmth. We look around us, just like King David looked around him 3,000 years ago, and we're left just like he was left, with this awesome sense of wonder at every single thing we see in the created order. And yes, absolutely, entirely, totally. We understand way more now than King David did 3,000 years ago, thanks to a whole bunch of really good scientific discovery that's taken place between then and now. But that doesn't take anything away, nothing at all away, from that profound sense of wonder. You all know this. I'm from Montana, for crying out loud. Like I've stood in some places that you look, and lots of you have been to these places, you stand there, and the only word you have is grandeur. You see it lay out before you, the grandeur of it all, and it causes the same stuff that welled up in King David 3,000 years ago to well up inside of me and you and all of us, because it points to something, capital S, someone, capital S. What if science is the lens through which you see God? There's a guy named Francis Collins. He's the leader of the International Human Genome Project, responsible for just this little task of mapping the human DNA sequence over the course of about a decade. Imagine that. Which, by the way, if you printed it on paper, would be, and then you stacked all of that paper up, the map of the human genome, the map of the human DNA would be as tall as the Washington Monument if you printed it on one side of a sheet of paper and stacked it up in one big stack. He stood next to President Bill Clinton in the East Room of the White House to make this announcement, this proclamation, this declaration of this scientific discovery. Prime Minister Tony Blair of the UK was linked via satellite into the event. Celebrations were happening all over the globe simultaneously at this magnificent achievement. And President Clinton began his speech by comparing the human genome sequence map to the map that Meriwether Lewis had unfolded in front of President Thomas Jefferson in that very room in the White House 200 years before. The president said, without a doubt, this is the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind, he said. The part of the speech that attracted the most public attention, and it did, was when the president all of a sudden leapt from the scientific to the spiritual. Today, the president said, we're learning, listen to this, the language in which God created life. We're gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. And you go like, whoa, stop the press. Shouldn't Collins, a rigorously trained scientist, be upset at such a blatant religious reference by the leader of the free world at this very moment, one of the great moments of scientific discovery in all of human history? Shouldn't Dr. Collins be scowling and staring at the floor in embarrassment? He says absolutely not a single chance. As a matter of fact, Collins says, I've worked very closely with President Clinton's speechwriter the days leading up to that speech. I strongly endorse that paragraph's inclusion in that speech. It has to be there, Collins says. When it came Collins' turn to say a few words, he echoed the president's sentiment. It's a happy day for the world, Collins said. It's humbling for me, awe-inspiring to me to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book previously known only to God. Wait a second, how can that possibly be? A president and a scientist announcing a major biological milestone and breakthrough, invoking any kind of connection to God. If we're to believe culture, the scientific and the spiritual are antithetical. They should never, ever meet up, and yet here they are in the East Room of the White House, quite meeting up. And Collins says, of course they meet up. For me, the experience of sequencing the human genome, uncovering the most remarkable of all texts, was both a stunning scientific achievement and an incredible occasion, his words, to worship God. What if science is actually the lens through which we see God? One more thing and then we'll wrap up. Discrediting the spiritual beliefs of about 40% of his colleagues as nothing more than sentimental nonsense. Very prominent evolutionist and atheist, a guy named Richard Dawkins. You've heard of Richard. One day said this: faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Again, pressing for the divide between science and faith. But could we agree? Could we just drive a stake in the ground, us here today, all of us, say it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be science or faith. It can and should and must be both and. It must be both and. It has to be. Why? Because the domain of science is merely, guys, to explore nature. That's science's charge. That's what it does. It's the extent of its reach, to explore nature, answer questions about nature, the scientific method, step by step, hypothesis, and the whole thing. But God's domain, the faith in God's domain, is the realm of the spiritual, a realm that is simply not possible to explore with the tools or with the language of science. You cannot do it. Faith and the existence of God has to be examined with the heart and with the soul and with the mind. The mind that has found the way to embrace both realms, both domains. And so please, do us this courtesy. Don't ever try to encumber science with answering questions like why? Like, why did the universe come into being? Why on earth am I here? What is the meaning and purpose of my life? What happens after we die? Science cannot answer those questions. It was never meant to. But God can. Faith can. God does. Faith does. With a richness and a depth of knowing our personal God, who is the creator, who is the designer of every single thing that exists, and you and me and all of humanity, and the ability to have your relationship with God restored, your relationship with people restored. Faith, science can coexist, and they must. Close your eyes and bow your heads if you would. God, we're really, really grateful that this faith that a whole bunch of us in this room hold in you can stand up to actual intellectual rigor. That we don't just have to leave it in the realm of heart and soul and touchy-feely and so, but it actually holds up to what it looks like for us to love you with all of our being, inclusive of our mind, Jesus. We're just so grateful for a faith that is robust and satisfactory and durable enough to stand up to really, really hard questions. God, you welcome them. And help us be people who also welcome them, who don't shy away, who engage in tough conversations, not to argue anybody into faith, but rather to be a signpost that invites people to take steps of further, deeper discovery of who you are, what you're doing, how you function, how you care for us, how you pursue us, how you love us ultimately, God. We're so very grateful, and we love you. And it's in your name we pray all of this, and everyone agreed and said, amen.